Welcome to Deb's Big Backyard. I'm Deb, and I'm doing one last turn on my compost pile before I harvest it. I already did this earth machine, and that good compost is on my vegetables and plants, but I'm not sure if this compost is cooked yet. So I'm going to head into Garfield Park Conservatory and talk to another oak parker, Melanie Harding. She's the program manager there, and they do a lot of composting. So let's go chat her up. Hi, Melanie.
Hi Deb, how are you this morning?
I'm great. At home I was going through my compost trying to find out if it was cooked yet, and I'm just not sure. So I thought I'd come and talk to you because I know you teach compost classes across Chicagoland. Mm-hmm. You're a home composter, yep. And you manage all this.
Right.
So
right.
Could we talk about what compost is and what you're doing here with it, and give me a few tips?
Sure. Let's open up the bin.
Okay.
And this is called a 3-bin outdoor composting system. Mm-hmm. And basically what's happening here is we have 3 separate working bins of compost happening. And so when we bring scraps from our garden, mm-hmm. they get chopped up and they get put in this first bin right here. And then as they start to decompose and the compost starts to happen, mm-hmm. We move it over to the second bin so that we can add new materials to the first bin and get that cooking. And then as this one starts to process,
sure.
we can move it over to the third bin where it can finish, and then we can finish that compost and get it back out into the soil to get those nutrients right back out into the soil.
What are the components of composting that ends up in that rich humus that we're putting on our gardens?
Sure. In general, composters have a vocabulary of talking about greens and browns. Greens are your fresh leaves if you're cutting down a tomato plant that has finished fruiting. It's the things that are fresh. Think of green, think of fresh.
Sure.
Browns are things that are more dry. So browns could be dried leaves in the fall. Browns could be sawdust. Browns could be straw or hay. The things that are already dried out, basically. And so compost is a mix, the secret to compost is a mix of green and brown.
What makes it actually the chemical reaction go?
Yeah, there is a lot of chemistry. I always tell, when I'm talking about compost, I said there's some really cool science going on in here. Even though you don't see it, there's some really cool science going on in here. What's happening basically is the greens and the browns are the food source for organisms called decomposers. And decomposers are, they can be as small as bacteria, and they can be as large as a centipede or an earthworm. And they are hard at work breaking down that material. So basically we are supplying the decomposers with food. And those, in return, those decomposers are making soil for us, basically making nutrients for our soil that we can put back into the earth rather than tossing it somewhere else.
Sure. And so how can you tell when your compost is ready to harvest?
It's a little bit subjective. There's no real secret. This bin here is looking pretty close to being finished. It still has a lot of chunks of, you can see sticks and dried leaves, even some newspaper, which is also good for composting. But if I were to take this material out of this bin and sift it using a screen or a hardware cloth like this, I would get all those chunks out and get a nice fine compost. And that finished compost is basically, there's not much in it that you would recognize anymore. So you wouldn't recognize it as leaves, you wouldn't recognize it as twigs or a banana peel or anything like that. It would be a fine, earthy, and it would have a great smell. In fact, I love to tell people, because they think it's gonna smell, to pull it out and just smell it, and it just smells like clean earth. And that's a really good sign that your compost is done as well.
What part does oxygen and water play in this whole chemical process of composting? It's
really important because you have, without getting too technical, you have organisms in your compost bin that are aerobic, meaning they want oxygen, like us. They want oxygen. And then you have organisms around in nature that are anaerobic, which means they don't need oxygen. And when you get those in your bin, when you get anaerobic or organisms that don't want oxygen, it starts to stink, it starts to smell. So if you have a stinky problem in your bin, it might mean that you don't have enough oxygen, and you might need to turn that turn that compost.
I have another burning question.
Okay.
Because I recently heard of a friend who was having some problem with some mice getting into their compost. How do you prevent that?
Yeah.
Or worse, rats.
Absolutely.
You don't want that,
No,
for
no.
gosh sakes.
And in the city, in the city of Chicago and most of the surrounding suburbs, there is an ordinance that your compost bin can have no larger than 1/4 inch holes or openings. So you'll see, for instance, on this bin that the hardware cloth is actually 1/4 inch, and all the edges are sealed up here.
Yeah.
So that's really important, and that's been determined to be the one key factor in keeping out rodents.
I see what I have in my backyard
Yes.
over here.
Sure.
And I don't know, you said you're a home composter as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have an earth machine or what you do.
I don't have an earth machine, but I have something similar. I do have a commercially made one rather than a wood one, and it's plastic like this, and it's very similar, except that it's square, and it has a door like this. So basically what happens is our materials go in. You notice there's no holes more than 1/4 inch
Right.
on this.
So how long does it usually take for compost to become, or for the materials out of your garden, the yard scraps and other things that are organic, how long does it take for them to become compost?
Again,
In general.
it's really hard to give an absolute answer to that question, because it's sort of determined by how much moisture, how often you turn it. Again, like if you're an active composter, you can probably get things in 6 to 8 weeks. You could probably get, in the summer, you could get something turned over in 6 to 8 weeks. But if you're a more passive composter and you do things a little bit more slowly, then it might take all summer, or it might be that that all your fall stuff just takes 4 or 6 months to cook over the winter, and it will keep cooking over the winter. It will be a lot slower because the temperature's down and those organisms are not working as efficiently, but it will still cook over the winter. As a city composter, the top 3 things to remember would be making sure that all of your spaces and gaps are sealed up, are not larger than 1/4 inch, because we don't want, once you bring in a pest like a rat or a mouse, then it's hard to get rid of. So we want to do that right from the beginning. So no holes bigger than 1/4 inch. As a hard rule, no meat, no fish, no bones, no dairy products. Eggshells are fine, but not the egg itself. And nothing that came from an animal, like a pet. So nothing like droppings from a cat or a dog or anything like that. And then the third thing I would say would be, I always tell when I'm teaching classes, I always say, if you learn one thing when you're with me today, it's don't dump and run. and by that I mean a couple of things. One is, so if you are composting food scraps like apple cores and banana peels and old lettuce that's wilted in the refrigerator, those are considered greens. We talked about browns and greens. What you want to do is make sure your greens are always covered with some browns.
Well, great, Melanie. I learned a lot about the composting, and there's a lot to learn about here at the Garfield Park Conservatory. What public education events coming up next?
There's a couple of things that would be relevant to what we're talking about today. One is that every Saturday we have a public education piece right here called Composters at Work, and people can drop in anytime between 10:30 and noon and just talk with our composters and get their questions answered. So it's very easy drop-in. Another way is that we are always looking for new composting volunteers, and we would love to train you out there on becoming a compost volunteer to help us. We produce a lot of plant waste here, and we want to make sure it gets back into the soil.
Thanks so much, Melanie.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming.
Sure. This is Deb's Big Backyard on the Road. See you next time.